Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have bad, good, and bad martinis for conservatives today. Happy Constitution Day, everyone, but it's going to be an ugly week. We're just going to tell you that right now, and depending on when these new hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee happen, that week will be ugly too, whether it's this week, next week, or whenever it is. Jim, we talked about this on Friday when it was just the anonymous story written by Ronan Farrow over at The New Yorker. We had a pretty good feeling, though, that since enough of the story had come out that would eventually hear from this woman directly, and now she has spoken to the Washington Post. Her name is Christine Blasey Ford. She says she is the one who was the victim of an attempted sexual assault. She says attempted rape by Brett Kavanaugh back in the early 1980s while they were high schoolers. In her story to the Washington Post, they had all been at the local country club / pool. They both went to private schools in the Bethesda area of Maryland. Kavanaugh an all-boys school, her an all-girls school. She went upstairs to use the bathroom. She said Kavanaugh and a buddy were deeply inebriated, pulled her into the bed, pinned her down, fumbled around with her clothes, trying to grope her, perhaps more, covered over her mouth while she tried to protest. And then the buddy jumped on a couple times, and they were so drunk they kind of flopped all over the place. She got out. Did not tell anyone at the time. In fact, did not tell anyone until 2012 when it came up in a therapy session. It says she did not want this to go public when she sent the letter to Congresswoman Eshoo, which eventually made its way to Senator Feinstein. So now, Jim, of course, you've got folks saying that the hearings, or at least the confirmation vote, has to be delayed. You've even got three Republicans saying that now, Corker, Flake, and Murkowski. Kavanaugh has said he's willing to testify again before the committee, once again saying that all of this is completely false, and he had no idea who was making this accusation until she identified herself Sunday to the Washington Post. Ford is apparently willing to testify before the committee as well, although her attorney says not this week. And so, Jim, this is a kind of a double-barreled martini. It's a catch-22 almost for Republicans. So either the nomination gets ditched by Republicans due to an allegation that has a lot of holes in the story, since this woman doesn't remember where it was, when it was, or what she did exactly before and after this, or you ultimately confirm a guy who half the country is going to think is a sexual predator right before the midterm election. So good luck, Republicans.
This is one of the ugliest stories that has come down the pike in a long time, because one way or another, this ends badly. If events occurred as Ford described, then I don't think there's any dispute that the actions described are sexual assault. And I myself would say, all right, that's disqualifying. You don't get to be on the Supreme Court for the rest of your life. If you did something like that, there are plenty of fine judges who don't have an accusation like this against them. The problem is we don't have a lot of details to this account, and we don't have any corroborating evidence. This apparently occurred in the late spring or summer of 1982. She cannot recall the exact date. She says it's around the end of her sophomore year. She doesn't remember the exact location. She doesn't remember who owned the house or how she got there. Now, look, this is 36 years ago. It's it's understandable that some memories would be hazy. Also, by her account, she had a beer. She's 15 at the time. Maybe that's affecting the ability to remember details and things like that. The problem is that now if, we could say, we can prove that Brett Kavanaugh was not in the D.C. area on these particular dates. It doesn't matter because, she could say, this happened in May, this happened in June, this happened in July. We don't really know exactly when this is. But if you have an accusation, you don't know the when and the where. Those are some pretty glaring omissions there. She says she told this to her therapist in 2012. She showed the therapist notes to the Washington Post. Now, here's the problem. The therapist notes, A, don't mention it being Kavanaugh, and B, say that 4 boys were involved. She says the therapist wrote down her story wrong. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. But either the therapist made a mistake, and if so, it would be nice if the therapist could come out and say, yes, I remember her saying that there were 2 boys involved, not 4. I wrote it down the wrong. Or if she said no in her initial telling of this, she said 4 boys were involved. Well, now we've got the story changing over time. The husband says that she mentioned this was Kavanaugh. We're not going to have any forensic evidence. Again, we don't even know the location of this particular event. She does mention one other person was in that room, and she describes it as a classmate of Kavanaugh named Mark Judge. Now, he issued a statement to the Weekly Standard saying, I repeat, I have no recollection of any of the events described in today's Post article or attributed to her letter. And he says he doesn't want to comment on this further, respecting his position in privacy. She named 2 other teenagers she said were at the party, and those individuals have not responded to messages from the Washington Post. So, at least as of the moment you and I are having this discussion, Greg, there are no photographs of Kavanaugh and this woman together, no letters, no other indication of correspondence. As I mentioned, no visible retained physical evidence. So we have an accusation, and we don't really have much more beyond the accusation. Yes, I know she took a polygraph. Polygraphs are not admissible in court for a reason. All a polygraph can really tell you is that the person believes they're telling the truth. That's there's a reason that we don't involve them in court cases. And oh, by the way, I believe Roy Moore, passed a polygraph, so you can file that one away. The other thing I'm kind of annoyed by here is that already this is being lumped in with the discussions of Me Too. Oh, it's also worth noting, look, Kavanaugh has been through 6 background investigations by the FBI. This did not come up by any of them. And there are no other accusations along these lines in the course of his career. We all heard about the letter signed by 65 female classmates. I mean, when it came against accusations against the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, the Matt Lauers of the world, the Charlie Roses of the world, not only were these much more recent than 36 years ago, they were part of a pattern of behavior. There was a discernible, okay, maybe one person is making a false accusation, but would multiple women over a course of a guy's life all tell similar stories without all meeting each other? And that's kind of what's turned into the decisive factor in a lot of these Me Too cases, is this idea of, okay, there are women in this world who lie. There are women in this world who will make up a story like this to get back at some man or something like that. But would many women all do this? I think there was, a moment where everybody loved Bill Cosby and thought, he's America's dad. We all loved him. There's no way he could have done this. And then once like 30, 40 women came forward with the same kind of story, it became harder to believe that all of them were lying and all of them had a vendetta against him. This hasn't happened in the case of Kavanaugh. We have one accuser. Now, again, if 3 women come forward with similar stories, all of a sudden this is a very different conversation. But as of now, it's one woman. And I was thinking about it. I went back and I checked today. There were at least 2 cases in the Me Too wave of controversy where the investigation went forward and no evidence was found. Ryan Lizza, formerly of the New Yorker, the CNN did their own investigation, and CNN said, you know what? We did an extensive investigation. We have no reason to keep him off the air. They brought him back. AMC reinstated the television host Chris Hardwick. Not every accusation is going to turn out to be true. Look, I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know if the accuser is telling the truth or lying. No one else knows the same thing either, other than her and Kavanaugh. I do note the interesting wrinkle here. I believe one of the last sentences of the Washington Post story about this woman quoted her husband as saying, well, a judge has to be assessed by a higher standard or held to a higher standard. He was confirmed as a federal judge back in 2006. So apparently this was not important enough to mention then, but it is important enough to mention now. Look, at some point, maybe we'll get further evidence or something else, some other account, other people at the party, something to either verify her claims or something to refute her claims. As it is now, I believe it's going to be her word against his. There's no harm in the committee hearing from her. If the committee hears from her, they certainly should hear from Kavanaugh again. He once again has issued a blanket statement that none of the events occurred. I think what's going to be ugly about this, Greg, besides the interminable fight coming this week and the accusations of you're defending rape or you're defending the destruction of a man's reputation, we're probably never going to get this fully resolved. And which means one of 2 things. Either he did something terrible and he never paid the price for it, or this woman came forward at the most convenient time to smear his reputation, and she probably will face no real consequence for it if her accusations are false.
Jim, we didn't have social media or the internet really during the Clarence Thomas hearings. You and I are old enough to remember that. I remember sitting glued to it on a Saturday morning when they reconvened the Senate Judiciary Committee because this allegation came in after the original hearings. Sound familiar? So it's going to be Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill on steroids, really, right?
Yeah. By the way, it's worth noting about how that shook out back then. Look, I mean, Anita Hill was on camera and put out her description of events and her account. And Clarence Thomas came out and people forget vehemently and impassionately denied it. And I believe the term, high-tech lynching was among the words he used to describe what he felt like he was going through. And at the time, the public believed him. And he was confirmed by a much narrower margin than most Supreme Court justices had been until then. Look, we will see how this shakes out. But at this point, I think it's safe to say that if you want someone to be held accountable for a sexual assault, you can't wait 36 years and then drop it on them and hope that everybody believes you. I don't think that's a very good way of holding people accountable, if indeed he did what he's accused of.
All right, Jim, let's move on to our lone good martini today. And as I mentioned, the Republicans are in kind of a catch-22 at the moment, at least to some extent with Kavanaugh. It might redound to the Democrats' electoral advantage either way. And if that's in fact the case, get ready for a nightmare of a Democratic agenda. In addition to all the investigative stuff they're planning to do with respect to President Trump, there's, of course, the big government agenda. And the darling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her socialist/progressive friends, she wants to pile up $40 trillion in new spending over 10 years. And she was on State of the Union with Jake Tapper, and he had the temerity to ask her about how you're going to actually pay for all this.
The price tag for everything that you've laid out in your campaign is $40 trillion over the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. I understand that Medicare for All would cost more to some wealthier people and to the government and to taxpayers while also reducing individual health care expenditures. But I'm talking about the overall package. You say it's not pie in the sky, but $40 trillion is quite a bit of money. And the taxes that you talked about raising to pay for this, to pay for your agenda, only count for 2. And we're going by left-leaning analysts.
Right. Well, when you look again at how our health care works, currently we pay much of these costs go into the private sector. So what we see is, for example, a year ago, I was working downtown in a restaurant. I went around and I asked how many of you folks have health insurance. Not a single person did, because they would have had to have paid $200 a month for a payment for insurance that had an $8,000 deductible.
Gosh, how did we get to the point where monthly payments and deductibles were so high? It's a head-scratcher. Jim, she kept going and eventually got to why millennials don't buy cars in her answer as to how she's going to pay for all this.
If you look at my generation, millennials, the amount of economic activity that we do not engage in, the fact that we delay purchasing homes, that we don't participate in the economy and purchasing cars, et cetera, as fully as possible, is a cost. It is an externality, if you will, of unprecedented amounts of student loan debt.
I'm assuming I'm not going to get an answer for the other $38 trillion.
No, you're not. But we learned a new word, maybe an externality. Jim, this comes as no surprise. The Democrats, even like Bernie Sanders, usually have no idea how they're going to pay for these grand government ambitions. What do you make of all this?
The first thing that's kind of fascinating is that this is not the first time she's gotten this question. This is, since she won the primary, she's gotten it by at least a good 6, maybe 7 times in fairly high-profile televised interviews, and she still doesn't have a better answer, Greg. This was the good answer. This is the practiced answer. This is, I wrote about this in the Jolt a bit today, that on the one hand, we can laugh at her meandering like a river verbiage, lack of specifics, and no real sense of, and insisting that all of this new spending is going to save money down the road, and thus it turns out to savings will be here. I do think also that one of the reasons you see the Democrats shifting towards giant new spending, even by the standards of Democrats of the past generation. I mean, the Democratic Leadership Council and New Democrats, the era of big government is over. That's all dead and buried. These are, these make the Obama administration look like a bunch of tightwads. Right now, we have a Republican president who really doesn't worry that much about deficits and debts. I know some Trump fans won't like hearing this, but we've got about $1 trillion deficit this year. Some of that's because of less revenue from the tax cuts, but really not that much. In fact, we've got revenue up a bit year over year. You can argue about whether it would have been higher if it's not up to the rate of inflation, et cetera, et cetera. But the gist is we still got a ton of money coming in. We have a huge amount of spending going out. And that's just the way our government finances have been for a very long time. This is the way they're going to be for a very long time. What's a little bit troubling is that this is the economic good times. This is with economic growth being high, dividends being high, earnings being high. People should be paying a lot more in, and we're not reducing it. We're not in the middle of a giant war. We're still involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, but we don't have nearly the level of troop commitments and material equipment commitments that we had during then. In other words, $1 trillion deficits are kind of the forecast now, and that's with nothing going wrong. If things do go wrong, they could be considerably higher. Republicans, by and large, aren't that worried about this. Occasionally, some folks give some lip service, but this is not the animating spirit of the party the way it was back during the rise of the Tea Party. So, Greg, I think Democrats are kind of comfortable with the idea of running a $2 trillion deficit or a $3 trillion deficit, or maybe even a $10 trillion deficit. Now, I do think at some point this does catch up to you economically, but I think Republicans have no longer concerned about the deficit and the debt the way they used to be. And I think Democrats have abandoned any pretense of it and are now just looking at how much can we spend as quickly as possible.
No, that's exactly right. We've talked about this a lot. The Democrats don't want to rein in spending because they think government is the solution to so many different challenges in our society. The Republicans, at least some of them, initially wanted to, but then the voters pushed back anytime the proposed cuts came anywhere close to their most beloved issues. And so the Republicans decided, well, we can't win if we actually get specific on this and make good on the promise. So what's the point? So everybody just keeps piling up the debt. Well done, everyone. All right, let's go to our final bad martini now. And Jim, sadly, this was somewhat predictable. Let's hope it can be turned around. New York Times here. For 7 years, Kim Jong-Un has pursued an in-your-face strategy for building his nuclear arsenal, detonating blasts underground and firing missiles into the sky, all to send the message that his country's nuclear buildup is irreversible. Now he appears to be changing his approach, current and former American intelligence officials say, tailoring it to his reading of the man he met for a few hours 3 months ago in Singapore, President Trump. It goes on to say that right now, current and former intelligence officials say new assessments suggest that Mr. Kim has carefully read Mr. Trump and concluded that as long as the optics are good and the exchanges between the two leaders are warm, he can hold off on demands for progress toward disarmament. If Mr. Kim does not conduct tests, Mr. Trump is unlikely to call out evidence of a continued nuclear buildup. North Korea is making nuclear fuel and building weapons as actively as ever, the publicly available evidence suggests. Just now, he appears to be borrowing a page from Israel, Pakistan, and India. He's keeping quiet about it, conducting no public nuclear demonstrations and creating no crises, allowing Mr. Trump to portray a denuclearization effort as on track. So, Jim, he wanted the photo op, he wanted the narrative, and apparently he's getting it.
I suppose if you really wanted to look at this from a certain angle and insist it's a good martini, yeah, we don't have any more test launches in a while. We haven't had test detonations of nuclear devices. The rhetoric has calmed down. There's less, you capitalist running dog, pig, swine will die in a sea of fire, blah, blah, blah. But if they're still developing nuclear weapons, then we're really not that much closer to where we want to get on this. I went back and forth on the outreach to North Korea. For a while, it did seem that it was calming the tensions over there. As I mentioned, these kind of symbolic gestures of cooperation. There was an inspection. There was a destruction of one facility, but people pointed out they may very well be done with their nuclear testing and/or this is not their state-of-the-art one. I think we're getting close to the point where we can, declare the summit a failure. That basically it was nice. It was a photo op. It gave Kim Jong-un exactly what he wanted, global superstar status. But it didn't get us closer to what we wanted, which was a North Korea without nuclear weapons. And that was always going to be a tall order. That was always going to be very difficult. Maybe it was beyond the capability of any president. I know this president likes to think of himself as the master deal maker, the guy who wrote the book on the art of the deal, et cetera, et cetera. It looks like we gave him a giant propaganda victory in exchange for some magic beans. I'd love to be proven wrong on this. I'd love to have seen it work and succeed. I don't think you can give the president too much grief for trying it, but it appears the skeptics have been proven right on this one, Greg. And that is very, very indeed a bad martini.
Oh, yes, very much so. That has always been kind of his MO for staying relevant, and since China and Russia seem completely uninterested in holding their feet to the fire, not a surprise he would try to pull a fast one here. So we'll see what Trump and Pompeo do once this evidence becomes even more clear. Jim?
Yeah, I just want to point out, Greg, Did I just say very indeed? I think I did.
Possibly.
And so I should not make fun of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for making up words.
Oh, man. It's quite a week already, Jim, and no, it's not Friday. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today, and please tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.